Hi, it's Christy Amobi. Today is the 50th anniversary of President Nixon signing the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. For those of you who don't know, the Controlled Substances Act was the piece of legislation that scheduled cannabis as a Scheduled I controlled substance. What that means in practicality is that the U.S. federal government has essentially scheduled marijuana as having no medicinal value. A Scheduled I controlled substance is not permitted for medical use, even under the supervision of a medical professional. So essentially saying cannabis, the safety profile of cannabis puts it on par with drugs such as heroin and LSD. Now, it's an interesting day for me because those of you who know me know that I'm very passionate about cannabis education. I have been a cannabis educator for a couple of years, working to just really make sure that people have informed decisions, that they understand how cannabis works in their body, and then they make an informed choice about whether or not to use cannabis for medical purposes and to some extent recreational purposes. Professionally, I've been working in the field of oncology for over 20 years. And it just so happens that today is also the annual meeting of the American Society of Radiation Oncology. There's an annual meeting going on right now as we speak. And this morning there was a session on the medical use of cannabis and its role in cancer care. So this is a very interesting juxtaposition to the legislation that we have that says that a person is the safety profile of cannabis is such that it cannot even be used under medical supervision. So what are some things that I learned today in attending the Astro event that I thought was particularly important to bring to light on this 50th anniversary? The first thing is that there are many clinical trials going on. They're very difficult to perform because of the rules that go into performing research on a Scheduled I controlled substance. Most people don't realize, in addition to just finding sources of funding, it's very difficult to get these studies approved because of the legislation governing how you do research on a Scheduled I controlled substance. You have to get the DEA involved. You have to get the DEA involved in site visits. You also have to get the FDA involved and doing research on an investigational drug. And in addition to that, there's only one place that you can source cannabis through a study that's gone through all of these checks and balances. It's through the University of Mississippi. So there's a lot of barriers to performing research. Nevertheless, research is being conducted. And some research was presented today in the context of the Astro annual meeting that showed that 30% of patients undergoing cancer care do see a reduction in pain with the use of medical cannabis. Now, this is both neuropathic pain and cancer pain. So I think this is a very interesting finding. We also know that up to 25% of patients undergoing some type of cancer treatment are using medical cannabis off-label, not just for pain, but also to treat nausea and vomiting associated with other parts of their care plan. So I think that in light of the fact that this is the 50th anniversary of the Controlled Substances Act being passed, it's important to think about these things that we're seeing, right? 33 states have approved the use of medicinal cannabis. 11 states have recreational laws on the books now. 13 states, many people are not aware of this, but 13 states have limited medical use. It's not a full-blown medical cannabis legislation, but 13 states do have laws on the books. So there's this real conflict between the federal law and the state law as it exists today. And I think it's also important to think about whether wherever you fall on this spectrum, in terms of advocacy, in terms of your support for medical cannabis, in terms of your support for recreational cannabis, I think many of us would agree that more research needs to be done, and the fact that cannabis is a Scheduled I controlled substance makes this very difficult, right? The history of how this came about, there were a lot of racial undertones. If you were to go back and to look at some of the initial legislation, the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, which put significant restrictions and fines on people using medicinal cannabis and recreational cannabis, that was largely driven out of a real anti-immigration type of stance. Many of you probably were unaware that cannabis was in the U.S. Pharmacopoeia back in 1850. It was listed as a treatment for alcoholism. It was removed in 1942, largely because of all of this reefer madness, media, anti-immigration, etc. So a lot of people talk about this period of time being the time that it's when cannabis was not medicine, right? Because cannabis, the sort of history of cannabis, it's been shown to really have a long legacy, thousands of years in terms of people recognizing the medicinal value. So I chose today to come here to you, not to talk about social equity, not to talk about social justice, while those are important topics. I just wanted us to reflect on the scheduling and what the scheduling means. And for those of you in my network, again, this is kind of this juxtaposition of different parts of my life coming together. For those of you in my network who are in the radiation oncology community and do have access to the Astro annual event, I would highly encourage you to go online and check out some of this information yourself. I thought the presentations today were very well presented. For those of you who want to learn more about cannabis, the endocannabinoid system, and some of the things that we know about the way that cannabis works, that we have CB1 and CB2 receptors in our bodies, that we produce endogenous cannabinoids in our bodies. I provide educational material on my own personal blog at rebelon.com, which you can access at any time. There's no charge. It's just a passion project of mine to make sure that people have accurate information about cannabis. I hope that we won't be in this same position in even 10 years from now. Again, as I mentioned, I think regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, all of us would advocate that more research needs to be done, and the descheduling of cannabis is absolutely imperative to making that happen. And if you don't advocate for full decriminalization, that's okay. Use your vote to vote for looking at ways that we can deschedule cannabis and really free up the research pipeline. All right, with that, I hope that you have a great week, and thank you for your attention.